The air in the mess tent at FOB Griffin hung thick and heavy, a soupy mixture of boiled chicken, diesel fumes, and the fine, pervasive dust of Kandahar. It was a place of loud noises, the clatter of metal trays, the scrape of boots on plywood floors, and the boisterous, chest-thumping laughter of men who spent their days staring at death and their nights pretending they weren't afraid. In the corner, sitting alone, was Sergeant Eva Rostova. She was new, a transfer from Bagram, assigned to the thankless, invisible world of logistics. She ate with a quiet efficiency that seemed to annoy the men around her, her movements small and precise, her focus entirely on the bland food on her tray. She didn't participate in the loud stories, didn't laugh at the crude jokes. She was a ghost at their feast, and her presence was an unwelcome silence in their symphony of noise. Sergeant Rex, Bulldog Miller, noticed her, as he always noticed anyone who didn't fit into his loud, simple world. He was a slab of a man, an infantry platoon sergeant whose neck was as thick as Rostova's thigh. He saw her composure not as professionalism, but as arrogance. REMF, a rear echelon motherfucker, who thought she was too good for the grunts. He swaggered over to her table, his two corporals, Diaz and Chen, trailing in his wake like hyenas orbiting a lion. "Well, look what we have here," Miller boomed, his voice cutting through the din. The nearby conversations faltered. "The new quartermaster. You finned in everything to your liking, Sergeant? The chicken not too dry for your delicate palate?" Rostova didn't look up. She methodically scooped a spoonful of corn, brought it to her mouth and chewed. Her lack of reaction was a bucket of gasoline on Miller's smoldering ego. He smirked at Diaz and Chun, a theatrical display of dominance. "Cat got your tongue? Or do they not teach you loggy folks how to talk to real soldiers?" He leaned over her, his shadow falling across her tray. He was holding a large cup of luridly purple sports drink, sweating condensation in the heat. "You know, a little respect goes a long way out here." He made a show of stumbling, his boot catching on the leg of the empty chair beside her. The cup tilted, and a cascade of ice-cold, sticky purple liquid sluiced down over Rostova's head. It ran through her tightly pinned brown hair, dripped down her forehead, and traced a cold path down her neck, soaking the collar of her uniform. The mess tent went dead silent. Every eye was on the small woman in the corner, dripping with purple humiliation. Chen winced. Diaz looked at his boots. Miller, however, threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Clumsy me," he roared. "Guess you'll need to requisition yourself a new shirt, Sergeant. Hope you know the right forms to fill out." Rostova remained seated for a 3 count. She didn't wipe her face. She didn't scream or curse. She simply set her spoon down on the tray with a soft, deliberate click. The sound was unnervingly loud in the sudden quiet. Then she rose. She moved not with anger, but with a fluid economy that was unnerving. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out gray, finally lifted to meet Miller's. They were flat, empty of emotion, like chips of stone. Miller's laughter died in his throat. He had expected tears or fury, something he could mock. This cold stillness was something else. "What's the matter, Sergeant? You got a problem?" Rostova didn't answer with words. Her left hand shot out, not in a punch, but with an open palm, striking the side of Miller's knee. It wasn't a hard blow, but it was perfectly placed. His leg buckled with a surprised grunt. As his massive frame dipped forward, unbalanced, her right hand moved in a blur. Her knuckles, held in a tight, precise formation, connected with the vagus nerve just below his ear. It was not a haymaker. It was a surgeon's strike. There was a soft, wet thud. Sergeant Miller's eyes rolled back in his head. His body, all 230 pounds of it, went completely limp. He collapsed onto the floor like a sack of wet cement, out cold before he even hit the plywood. A collective gasp rippled through the tent. Rostova stood over him, the purple drink still dripping from the ends of her hair onto the unconscious man's face. She looked down, her expression unchanged, then turned and walked out of the mess tent, leaving a stunned silence and a fallen giant in her wake. Colonel Thorne's office was an oasis of frigid, air-conditioned order in the chaos of the FOB. The walls were bare except for topographical maps of the surrounding provinces, marked with red circles and arrows. Thorne was a man who believed in discipline above all else. He was lean, sharp-featured, with a gaze that could peel paint. He looked at Sergeant Rostova, standing at parade rest before his desk, and saw a problem. "I have a report," Thorne said, his voice a low, dangerous monotone. "That you assaulted a senior NCO in my mess hall. That you incapacitated him in front of 30 other soldiers. Sergeant Miller is a decorated platoon sergeant. You are a logistics specialist who has been in my command for 72 hours. To his right, in another chair, sat Sergeant Miller. A medic had cleared him, but a livid purple bruise was blooming on his jaw and his pride was clearly shattered. He stared at Rostova with a mixture of hatred and something he couldn't quite identify, a sliver of fear. "He poured a drink on my head, sir," Rostova stated. It wasn't an excuse. It was a simple, factual report. "And your response to this minor provocation was to render him unconscious?" Thorne steepled his fingers, his eyes narrowing. "I've reviewed your file, Sergeant Rostova. Clean. Spotless. Quartermaster School, Supply Chain Management certifications, efficiency awards. Not a single mark on your disciplinary record. Not a single combat deployment listed. You've spent your career counting widgets and signing forms from Bagram to Ramstein. So tell me, where exactly in your supply depot training did they teach you to drop a man twice your size with a single punch?" Rostova's expression remained neutral. "Self-defense, sir. He was aggressive and encroaching on my personal space." Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. "Personal space? Sergeant, this is a war zone. The enemy is not going to respect your personal space. Your fellow soldiers, especially your superiors, expect you to have a thicker skin than that. What you did was an unacceptable breach of discipline. It undermines the chain of command. It makes my NCOs look weak." Miller shifted in his chair, a low growl in his throat. "She got in a lucky shot, sir. That's all." Thorne ignored him, his focus entirely on Rostova. He wanted to see a crack in her composure. A flicker of fear, of regret, of anything. He saw nothing. It was like talking to a machine. "You are a disruption, Sergeant," Thorne continued, his voice dropping. "I don't have time for disruptions. My people are focused on the wire, on the enemy. They don't have time for barracks drama from a paper pusher who can't handle a joke." He picked up a flimsy sheet of paper from his desk. "Since you are so concerned with inventory, I have a special assignment for you. The Echo 7 Supply Depot. It's a series of old Chronicles containers on the far western perimeter. Hasn't been properly cataloged in years. It's your responsibility now. I want a full, itemized inventory of every single container. Every box, every crate, every bullet. I want it on my desk by 0800 Friday. Understood?" This was a punishment, and they both knew it. The Echo 7 Depot was a graveyard of forgotten equipment, miles from the main compound, baking under the sun. It was a tedious, solitary, and utterly demeaning task. It was a clear message. You are not one of us. You are a clerk, and you will be treated as such. "Yes, sir," Rostova said, her voice even. "And Sergeant Miller," Thorne said, turning his icy gaze on the infantryman. "Your platoon is on QRF duty for the next week, and you will personally apologize to Sergeant Rostova for your part in this." Miller's jaw tightened. "Sir, that's an order, Sergeant. You will apologize for your unprofessional conduct." Thorne looked back at Rostova. "This incident is over. You are dismissed. Get to your depot." Rostova executed a crisp about-face and walked out of the office. She didn't look at Miller. She didn't offer any parting words. Her footsteps were silent on the plywood floor. Miller stood, his face a mask of fury. "Sir, with all due respect." "Shut up, Miller." Thorne cut him off, not even looking at him. "You embarrassed yourself. You picked a fight with a logistics NCO and got laid out like a rookie. Now you're going to do your job. Get out." Miller stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Thorne stared at the closed door for a long moment, then looked down at Rostova's file again. Clean. Too clean. Felt wrong. He had a sense, a deep, instinctual feeling honed by 30 years of command, that he had just made a serious miscalculation. He just didn't know what it was yet. He tossed the file onto his desk. Paper pusher. That's all she was. The incident was over. The Echo 7 depot was exactly as advertised. A desolate stretch of sun-bleached gravel on the very edge of the FOB's perimeter. Behind it, nothing but the razor wire fence and the vast, empty expanse of the Afghan desert. Before it, a dozen rust-streaked shipping containers sat in 2 neat rows, baking in the relentless afternoon sun. The air shimmered with heat. The only sounds were the distant hum of the base generator and the whisper of wind across the sand. Rostova arrived with a ruggedized laptop, a handheld scanner, and a canteen of water. She wore no expression as she surveyed her kingdom of forgotten things. She unlatched the heavy steel door of the first container. It groaned open with a screech of rusted metal, releasing a blast of superheated, stale air. Inside, stacked to the ceiling, were wooden crates of 762mm ammunition, their stencils faded by time. She didn't sigh. She didn't curse her luck. She simply got to work. Her movements were a study in methodical grace. She scanned the barcode on the first crate, entered the data into her laptop, checked it twice, and moved to the next. Her focus was absolute. The sun beat down, her uniform was soaked with sweat, but her pace never wavered. Crate by crate, box by box, she imposed order on the chaos. This was her world. Data, logistics, the quiet certainty of numbers. It was a language she understood. Hours bled into one another. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The heat finally began to break. In the distance, the call to prayer echoed from a local village. Rostova was now in the 4th container, cataloging boxes of medical supplies, bandages, 4 bags, morphine syringes. She worked by the light of a chemical glow stick she'd cracked and hung from a hook. That's when the world exploded. It wasn't one sound, but a symphony of violence. The deep, guttural thump-thump-thump of outgoing mortars from the FOB was answered almost instantly by the high-pitched whistle and deafening crack of incoming rounds. The ground shook. A geyser of dirt and shrapnel erupted 100 yards away. Then came the rattle of heavy machine gun fire from outside the wire, a sound like canvas being ripped apart. The base sirens began their frantic, rising and falling wail. Rostova didn't flinch. She didn't dive for cover. She set down her scanner, her movements still unervingly calm, and moved to the door of the Chronicles. She peered around the edge, her eyes scanning the perimeter. The main attack, a storm of RPGs and machine gun fire, was hitting the south gate, a classic feint designed to draw the quick reaction force. Her eyes, however, were on the wire directly in front of her depot. A small guard post, manned by 2 soldiers, was positioned 200 meters to her left. As she watched, an RPG streaked out of the twilight and slammed into it. The wooden structure disintegrated in a flash of orange and black smoke. The chatter of the M240B machine gun inside abruptly stopped. This wasn't a feint. This was the breach point. Figures began to emerge from the dusk, moving low and fast towards the hole in the wire. 10, then 20, then more. They were disciplined, moving in fire teams, laying down suppressive fire as they advanced. They knew the FOB's response would be focused on the south gate. They had chosen the weakest, most neglected part of the perimeter. Her perimeter. Inside the FOB, chaos reigned. The radio net was a cacophony of panicked shouts. Colonel Thorne was in the Tactical Operations Center, barking orders, trying to get a clear picture of the attack. Miller's QRF platoon was already mounted, racing towards the sound of the guns at the south gate. Dragon 6, this is Watchtower 2. We have heavy contact at the south gate. Multiple RPGs, heavy machine gun fire. Griffin QRF, this is Dragon 6. Proceed to the south gate and repel the attack. All other units, maintain perimeter security. Alone, Static-laced voice cut through. Dragon 6, this is Sentry 4. We're taking fire on the western perimeter. Sentry 5 is down. I repeat, Sentry 5 is down. They're coming through the wire. Thorn's head snapped towards the map. The western perimeter. Echo 7. The punishment detail. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. There were only a handful of guards on that entire stretch. The QRF was already committed. Sentry 4, what's your status? Thorn demanded. The only answer was a burst of static, followed by the distinct, terrifying sound of a close-range firefight, and then silence. Back at the depot, Rostova saw the guard post go down. She saw the enemy fighters pouring through the wire. She saw 2 young soldiers, PFC Chan and a specialist she vaguely recognized as Diaz, pinned down behind a low sandbag wall, firing their rifles blindly into the darkness, their movements jerky with terror. They were the only thing between the attackers and the soft, unprotected belly of the FOB, and they were about to be overrun. The logistician vanished. The woman who counted bullets and signed forms was gone. In her place stood something else entirely, something cold and ancient. Her first move was not towards a weapon, but towards the inventory. Her mind, trained to see supply chains and asset distribution, now saw a tactical landscape. Container 5, communications gear. Useless. Container 6, meals ready to eat. Useless. Container 3, small arms ammunition. Useful. Container 7, pyrotechnics and signaling devices. Very useful. She moved with a speed that was terrifyingly efficient. She didn't run. She flowed. She slid into Container 3, her hands finding a crate of 556mm magazines in the dark as if she'd packed it herself. She grabbed 4, stuffing them into her cargo pockets. She found a discarded M4 rifle next to one of the fallen guards from the destroyed post, its optic shattered. She scooped it up. She checked the chamber, slapped in a fresh magazine, and racked the charging handle in one smooth, practiced motion. The sound was crisp, final. She didn't take cover behind the Chronicles. That was what they would expect. Instead, she climbed onto it. Using a stack of discarded pallets as a ladder, she scaled the 8-foot wall of corrugated steel, lying flat on the roof. From here, she had a commanding view of the entire breach point. The attackers were moving with confidence now, advancing in a wedge formation, their fire pinning down Chan and Diaz. Rostova settled the rifle into the crook of her shoulder. The iron sights were all she had. In the fading light, it was a difficult shot. She didn't aim for the center of mass. She took a breath, let half of it out, and focused on the man at the point of the wedge, the one giving orders. The trigger squeeze was slow, deliberate. The rifle cracked, a single, sharp report that was distinct from the chaotic full-auto fire of the others. The enemy point man dropped without a sound. The attackers faltered, confused. The shot hadn't come from the sandbag wall. They scanned the darkness, looking for the source. Rostova was already shifting her position, crawling silently to the other side of the container. She acquired her next target. A man carrying an RPK machine gun, the biggest threat to the pinned-down soldiers. Breath in, half out, squeeze. The RPK gunner crumpled. Now they knew where she was. A hail of bullets hammered against the side of the Chronicles, a deafening drumbeat of incoming fire. Rostova was already moving, sliding off the back of the container and dropping silently to the ground. She landed in a crouch, the impact absorbed by her legs. She was a ghost in the shadows between the containers. Diaz! Her voice cut through the noise of the firefight. It wasn't a shout, but a low, clear command that sliced through his panic. On my mark, suppress the left flank. 3-round bursts. Conserve your ammo. Diaz, startled, looked around wildly. Who is that? Chan. Watch your right. They'll try to flank you through that ditch. The 2 young soldiers, who had been on the verge of breaking, were momentarily stunned by the voice of calm authority. They didn't know who it was, but they obeyed. Diaz began firing controlled bursts to the left. Rostova used their covering fire to move. She darted from the cover of one container to the next, her silhouette a fleeting shadow against the darkening sky. The attackers, their momentum broken, had taken cover behind a low berm. They were setting up a machine gun to rake the entire area. Rostova knew she couldn't take them all on from one position. She needed to create chaos. She slipped into Container 7, the pyrotechnics depot. Her hands moved with certainty in the dark, grabbing 3 trip flares and a flare pistol. She emerged and crawled to the far end of the depot, flanking the enemy's own flanking maneuver. She silently planted the trip flares in a wide arc in the path she knew they would take. Then she returned to her position between 2 containers that formed a perfect narrow kill zone. She waited. The enemy fire slackened as they began to move up, believing they had suppressed the only defenders. A fire team of 4 men broke from the berm. Running low towards the ditch, Chun was watching. They were confident, moving to finish this. Rostova raised the flare pistol, aimed it not at them, but at the sky directly above them, and fired. The red starburst ignited with a loud hiss, bathing the entire area in a ghastly crimson light. The 4 men were caught in the open, their shadows thrown long and stark against the sand. They were perfect silhouettes. Rostova's M4 spoke 4 times. Crack, 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 for precise shots. For men fell. The enemy commander, somewhere in the darkness, screamed an order. The second fire team, trying to flank from the other side, ran directly into her trap. The trip flares ignited one after another, brilliant white magnesium flares that turned night into day, blinding the attackers and exposing their position completely. Chun and Diaz, no longer firing blindly, opened up with renewed purpose, their rounds finding their marks in the sudden, harsh light. But the enemy were not conscripts. They were seasoned fighters. They adapted. An RPG team set up behind the berm. Rostova saw the backblast a split second before the rocket launched. She didn't have time to run. She dove back into the narrow gap between the steel containers just as the rocket impacted the one she had been using for cover. The explosion was immense. The steel wall of the Chronicles buckled inwards, screaming in protest. Shrapnel whizzed through the air like angry hornets. The sheer concussive force picked Rostova up and slammed her against the opposite container. Her head hit the steel wall with a sickening crack. Her vision swam in a sea of black spots. For a moment, the world was a muffled, ringing void. She lay there, dazed, the taste of blood in her mouth. Her left arm was on fire, a long gash torn open by a piece of flying metal. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the attackers pressing their advantage, their shouts growing closer. Chun and Diaz's fire was faltering again. They were running low on ammo, their courage draining with every magazine. Rostova pushed herself up. Pain was just data. She ignored it. She tore a strip of fabric from her sleeve and tightly wrapped it around the wound on her arm. A crude but effective tourniquet. She had lost her rifle in the blast. She was down to her sidearm and a combat knife. They were closing in. She could hear their footsteps on the gravel, just on the other side of the container. She drew her M9 pistol. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She was backed into a corner. And she was at her most dangerous. The QRF, led by Sergeant Miller, finally arrived at the western perimeter, drawn by the secondary explosions. They found a scene of utter carnage. The Sentry 5 post was a smoking ruin. The bodies of at least 15 enemy fighters lay scattered across the gravel between the wire and the Echo 7 depot. The attack had been broken, the survivors already melting back into the desert. Colonel Thorne arrived moments later, his vehicle screeching to a halt. He stepped out, his face grim, expecting to find his token guard force slaughtered and the depot ransacked. Instead, he found PFC Chun and Specialist Diaz, alive, sitting behind their sandbag wall, their rifles empty, their faces pale with shock and awe. "What happened here, Specialist?" Thorne demanded, his voice tight. Diaz just shook his head, unable to speak, and pointed a trembling finger towards the Chronicles containers. "Her," he whispered. "It was all her." Thorne and Miller moved forward cautiously, their men fanning out to secure the area. They rounded the corner of the first row of containers and stopped dead. The area was a perfectly constructed kill zone. The ground was littered with brass casings. Trip flares lay smoking on the ground. One container was buckled and scorched from an RPG hit. And in the middle of it all, leaning against a container wall, was Sergeant Eva Rostova. She was covered in dust and grime, a bloody makeshift bandage on her arm. She held an M9 pistol in her right hand, its slide locked back on an empty magazine. At her feet lay two more enemy fighters, killed at close range. She was calmly using her good hand to eject the empty magazine and retrieve a fresh one from her belt. She didn't seem to notice their arrival. She was just reloading. Miller stared, his mouth agape. This was not the quiet, bookish logistics sergeant he had humiliated hours ago. This was something else. The sheer tactical brilliance of the defense was obvious to any trained soldier. The use of the high ground, the creation of kill zones, the psychological impact of the flares, it was the work of a master. Thorne approached slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The placement of the enemy bodies, the angles of fire, the impossible odds. He looked at Rostova, at the cold, professional calm in her eyes, and then at her file in his mind's eye. Logistics, supply chain management, no combat deployments. It was a lie, a complete and utter fabrication. His gaze fell on her wrist, where the sleeve had been torn away by the shrapnel. Partially visible beneath the blood and grime was a tattoo. It was a single stylized black bird, its wings swept back as if in a dive. A raven. An old memory surfaced in Thorne's mind, a piece of battlefield lore whispered in hushed tones in intelligence briefings years ago. A ghost. A solo operator from a unit that didn't officially exist. An asset used for the most dangerous, deniable operations. They had a call sign, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence by those who knew. Major Costa, Thorne's XO who had just arrived with the second wave, saw it at the same time. His eyes went wide. He stepped closer to Thorne and spoke in a low, shaky whisper, his voice full of disbelief. "Sir, do you see her wrist? My God, that's the mark. The raven." Thorne's blood ran cold. The raven, Voron. The legend was that Voron was not one person, but a title given to the unit's best. But the stories always centered on one woman. An operative credited with dismantling an entire terror cell in Vienna with nothing but a garrote and a stolen laptop. A sniper who held off a company-sized ambush in the Hindu Kush for 3 days, alone, until reinforcements could arrive. She was supposed to have been killed in action in Chechnya 5 years ago. He looked from the tattoo back to her face. The pale gray eyes, the absolute lack of fear, the almost inhuman composure under fire. It wasn't a lucky shot in the mess hall. It was muscle memory. It was who she was. The logistics file was a cover, a deep, long-term legend to bury a ghost who was supposed to stay dead. By assigning her to this isolated post, by underestimating her, he had inadvertently placed his most lethal asset at the precise point of the enemy's main attack. He hadn't punished her. He had deployed her. Rostova finished reloading her pistol. She holstered it with a smooth, economical motion and finally looked up, her gaze meeting Thorne's. There was no defiance in her eyes. No, I told you so. There was nothing but a quiet, professional assessment. The world around them came back into focus. Medics were moving in, checking on Chan and Diaz, and tending to the wounded. Soldiers were securing the perimeter, their voices a low murmur. But in the space between the colonel and the sergeant, there was a profound silence. The dismissal, the mockery, the arrogance. It had all evaporated in the heat of the battle, replaced by a stark, undeniable truth. Sergeant Miller approached, his usual swagger completely gone. He looked like a man who had just seen a god, and found it terrifying. He walked up to Rostova, stopping a few feet away. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The words of his forced apology from earlier seemed like a pathetic joke now. He looked at the carnage she had wrought, at the blood on her arm, at the cold steel in her eyes. "Sergeant," he finally managed to say. The word was heavy with a new, profound respect. It wasn't the title of a clerk. It was the title of a warrior. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of surrender and deference from one professional soldier to another. Rostova just looked at him, her expression unreadable. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod in return, accepting the gesture. The incident was over. For good. Colonel Thorne stepped forward, his mind racing. Apologies were useless. Commendations were impossible. She didn't officially have the skills to be commended for. To acknowledge who she was would be to break a dozen protocols and expose a secret far above his pay grade. He had to address the Sergeant Rostova on his roster, not the ghost standing in front of him. His eyes fell on the ruggedized laptop lying near the entrance of the Chronicles, its screen cracked but still glowing. Next to it was the clipboard with her neat, precise handwriting. It was spattered with blood. Thorne bent down and picked up the clipboard. He looked at the columns of numbers, the perfect inventory she had been taking before all hell broke loose. He held it out to her. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice formal, devoid of all previous condescension. "You have a deadline. Your report is due on my desk by 0800 Friday." It was the only thing he could say. It was an order, but it was also an apology. It was an acknowledgement of her duty, of her incredible, terrifying professionalism. It was his way of saying, "I see you. I was wrong." Rostova took the clipboard. She looked at the bloodstains on the paper, then back at him. "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the entire battle. "I'll have it done." The last of the enemy bodies had been cleared. The breach in the wire had been patched. The adrenaline of the fight had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the low hum of a bass returning to its nocturnal rhythm. Medics had cleaned and stitched the gash on Rostova's arm, a neat row of black sutures against her pale skin. They had offered her painkillers, which she had quietly refused. They had ordered her to rest, an order she had quietly ignored. She was not in her bunk. She was not in the mess tent, where the story of what happened was already spreading like wildfire, mutating with each telling into a legend. She was back at the Echo 7 depot. The area was lit now by the harsh, white glare of portable light towers. The crime scene cleanup crew had done their work, but the air was still thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of burnt cordite. The ground was scarred, littered with brass and the dark stains of the fallen. The buckled Chronicles container stood as a monument to the ferocity of the attack. Rostova was sitting on an empty ammo crate in the narrow space between two containers, the same space where she had been when the rocket hit. In her lap was the M4 she had used, the one she had retrieved after the firefight. It was completely disassembled. The upper receiver, the lower receiver, the bolt carrier group, the trigger assembly, every piece was laid out in perfect order on a clean rag. She worked under the light of a single chemlight, its green glow casting long, dancing shadows. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a ritual of purification. With a small brush and a bottle of solvent, she began to clean the bolt. She scrubbed away the carbon fouling, the fine grit of the desert, the residue of the battle. Each tiny groove, each locking lug, was given her complete and undivided attention. This was her center. Not the violence itself, but the meticulous care of the tools of that violence. It was a way of restoring order to the chaos, of washing away the grim work of the night. There was no satisfaction on her face, no pride. Just a quiet, focused intensity. This was not a celebration of victory. It was the work of a professional resetting her instruments. From the edge of the light, two figures watched her. PFC Chun and Specialist Diaz. They had been tasked with standing guard over the depot for the rest of the night. They stood in silence, not daring to approach or speak. They watched the woman who had saved their lives, the logistics clerk who fought like a demon, as she quietly and methodically cleaned her weapon. They saw not a hero, but something far more intimidating. A master of a craft they were only just beginning to understand. A little while later, another figure emerged from the darkness. Colonel Thorne. He walked to the edge of the lit area and stopped. He didn't say a word. He just stood and watched. He saw the same thing Chun and Diaz saw. He saw the absolute, unwavering discipline that had saved his FOB. He saw the ghost he had been charged with, a weapon hidden in plain sight, and he finally, truly understood the mistake he had made in the mess tent. It wasn't that Miller had picked a fight with the wrong soldier. It was that he had treated a precision instrument like a common rock. Rostova finished with the bolt, wiping it clean until the metal gleamed dully in the chemical light. She re-oiled it with a single, practiced drop and set it aside. She moved on to the next piece, her focus never wavering, seemingly oblivious to her audience. Thorne watched for a full 10 minutes. He saw her reassemble the rifle, her hands moving with a fluid familiarity that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. The clicks and snaps of the parts locking into place were the only sounds in the quiet night. When she was done, she performed a functions check, the metallic clack of the charging handle echoing in the stillness. She placed the rifle beside her, its purpose fulfilled, its cleanliness restored. Then, she picked up the clipboard and the pen. She clicked the pen, and in the eerie green light, she bent over the blood-stained inventory sheet and began to write, her handwriting as neat and precise as ever. She was finishing her job. The first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, a pale, gray line on the horizon. Colonel Thorne turned without a word and walked back into the darkness, leaving the sergeant to her inventory. The message was received. The respect was absolute. The ghost of FOB Griffin was back on the books, her lethal nature once again hidden behind a wall of numbers and forms. But no one who had been there that night would ever look at a logistics clerk the same way again.